At approximately 10:30 in the morning of November 8, 1519, Hernán Cortés and his expedition of around 500 Spanish soldiers and about 1,000 indigenous allies reached the edge of the Great Lake Texcoco. Before them lay the island city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. It was a city built on water, connected to the mainland by 3 long causeways. The air was thin at over 7,000 feet above sea level, and the sun bore down on armor and cotton padding alike. Cortés had already been in the region for months, marching inland from the Gulf Coast, fighting battles, making alliances with native groups who resented Aztec rule. Now he stood at the threshold of the most powerful city in Mesoamerica. Everything seemed normal. A delegation of Aztec nobles approached, then parted to make way for the emperor himself. Moctezuma II stepped forward under a canopy of green feathers, carried on a litter adorned with gold and turquoise. He wore a crown of gold and a mantle of turquoise mosaic. His sandals were gold-soled. The Spanish chroniclers would later describe the scene in detail. Moctezuma descended from his litter and Cortés dismounted from his horse. The 2 men met on the causeway. Moctezuma spoke first, according to accounts, welcoming Cortés as a long-awaited visitor, a descendant of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, a figure whose return had been prophesied. Cortés, through his interpreter La Malinche, replied with diplomacy. He presented gifts, glass beads, and fine cloth. Moctezuma presented gold and silver ornaments. The emperor then invited Cortés and his men into the city. They walked together across the causeway into Tenochtitlan. The streets were crowded with people. The Spanish saw temples, palaces, canals, markets. They saw the Great Pyramid of Templo Mayor. They saw a civilization as complex and advanced as any in Europe. Only a few minutes later, or rather within days, something was off. Cortés had been granted a residence inside the city, a palace formerly belonging to Moctezuma's father. But the Spanish noticed the layout, the defensive positions, the sheer number of Aztec warriors. They understood their own vulnerability. They were surrounded by a population that vastly outnumbered them. They had no secure line of retreat. The causeways could be cut. The supplies could be blocked. Cortés decided that the only way to control the situation was to take the emperor himself prisoner. On November 14, 1519, less than a week after entering the city, Cortés invited Moctezuma to his quarters on a pretense, and when the emperor arrived, the Spanish seized him. They placed him under armed guard. Moctezuma was forced to obey Cortés's commands. The Aztec Empire was now being run from inside a single palace, with its sovereign held hostage. What happened? The seizure of Moctezuma was a bold move, but it did not solve the fundamental problem of numbers. The Spanish were in the heart of a hostile city, holding its ruler by force. They demanded gold, and the Aztec elites complied, bringing tribute from storehouses and temples. But the tension grew. The Spanish began to discover hidden rooms filled with precious objects, and they melted down works of art into ingots. They desecrated the temple of Huitzilopochtli and erected a Christian cross and an image of the Virgin Mary. The Aztec priests and warriors grew restless. In the spring of 1520, while Cortés was away dealing with a Spanish rival who had arrived from Cuba, a massacre occurred at the main temple during a festival. Spanish soldiers attacked unarmed Aztec nobles and worshippers, killing hundreds. When Cortés returned, the city was in open rebellion. The Aztecs surrounded the palace where the Spanish were holed up. They cut off supplies. They attacked from rooftops. On June 30th, 1520, the Spanish tried to flee the city under cover of darkness. It was a desperate retreat across the causeways, laden with gold. The Aztecs attacked from boats and from the causeway itself. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies were killed, drowned, or captured. The gold they had looted was lost in the lake. This night would be remembered by the Spanish as the Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. How did this happen? The Spanish had misjudged the situation. They believed that holding the emperor would control the empire, but the Aztecs were not a monarchy in the European sense. Power among the Mexica was distributed among nobles, priests, and military leaders. Moctezuma himself had been a sacred figure, but when he appeared on the rooftop to appeal for calm, his own people threw stones and arrows at him. He was struck and died. Whether from the attack or from Spanish hands is still debated. The Spanish lost their hostage and their advantage. They retreated to Tlaxcala, their indigenous allies, and regrouped. Cortés planned a siege. He ordered the construction of 13 small ships, called brigantines, to be carried in pieces over the mountains to the lake. He gathered tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. He cut off the supply lines to Tenochtitlan, blockaded the city, and launched a systematic campaign of destruction. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted from May to August of 151. Each causeway was assaulted, each street taken, each building burned. The Spanish used cannons, crossbows, and swords. Their indigenous allies fought with obsidian-edged clubs and spears. Smallpox, introduced by the Spanish, ravaged the Aztec population. The city was reduced to rubble. By August, the defenders were starving. Cortés offered a surrender, but Cuauhtémoc, the new emperor, refused. On August 13, 1521, the final assault began. The Spanish and their allies overwhelmed the remaining defenders. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape in a canoe. The city of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. What investigators later reconstructed from surviving indigenous and Spanish accounts was a story of cultural breakdown, military miscalculation, disease, and greed. The Spanish system of conquest was not a single plan, but a chain of decisions driven by the search for gold, the spread of Christianity, and the personal ambition of men like Cortés. The Aztec system of tribute and alliance had worked for centuries, but it created resentments that the Spanish exploited. The allies who fought alongside Cortés were not loyal subjects of Spain. They were enemies of the Aztecs, and they used the invasion to break free from tribute obligations. After the conquest, the Spanish imposed a new system. The city was rebuilt as Mexico City. The temples were torn down and replaced with churches. The gold was shipped back to Spain. The indigenous population was subjugated, converted, and forced to labor in mines and on estates. What systems failed? The Aztec defensive system relied on the idea that the capital was impregnable, protected by water and causeways. That was true against conventional Mesoamerican warfare, but the Spanish brought siege techniques, ships, and an alliance network that bypassed the defenses. The Aztec communication system of runners could not coordinate a nationwide resistance quickly enough. The Spanish political system, meanwhile, was unstable. Cortés had been ordered not to make conquests by the governor of Cuba, but he defied those orders, burned his ships, and established his own authority. The Spanish crown later validated his actions, but the conflict between independent conquistadors and royal authority would continue for decades. Why does this still matter? The conquest of the Aztec Empire was the beginning of the Spanish colonial system in the Americas, a system that extracted enormous amounts of gold and silver for over 3 centuries. The silver from mines like Potosi in Peru and Zacatecas in Mexico funded the Spanish Empire and reshaped the global economy. The gold and silver that poured into Europe caused inflation and funded wars. The forced labor systems, the encomienda and later the repartimiento, destroyed native communities and led to a demographic catastrophe. The introduction of diseases killed millions. The Spanish also imposed their language, religion, and culture, which survive today in the form of Latin America's Spanish-speaking Catholic majority. The event also set a pattern for future European colonial expansion, a pattern of violence, exploitation, and cultural erasure that would repeat across the world. The Spanish Empire extended far beyond Mexico. By the mid-16th century, it controlled territories from California to Patagonia, from the Philippines to the Caribbean. The empire built an administrative structure based on viceroyalties, audiencias, and Catholic missions. Its ships crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, carrying silver, spices, and souls. The Spanish crown claimed the exclusive right to colonize and evangelize these lands, granted by papal bulls in the 1490s. But the empire was never fully in control. Local officials often operated with impunity. Indigenous communities resisted, rebelled, and adapted. African slaves were brought to work where native populations had died out. The empire was a patchwork of compromise, coercion, and corruption. The opening segment of this story begins with that precise moment on the causeway when two worlds met. It was a meeting that would change the course of history. For the Spanish, it was the beginning of a vast imperial project. For the Aztecs, it was the end of a civilization. The events that followed, the capture of Moctezuma, the Noche Triste, the siege, the fall, have been analyzed by historians for centuries. And still, questions remain. Could the Aztecs have repelled the invasion if they had formed a unified response? Could the Spanish have succeeded without the help of indigenous allies? What role did Moctezuma's own religious beliefs play in his hesitation? How much of the story as we know it was shaped by Spanish accounts that sought to justify the conquest? The answers are incomplete. But the events themselves are not in doubt. On August 13, 1521, the city of Tenochtitlan fell. The Spanish Empire in the Americas had begun in earnest. And at the heart of it was gold, God, and a type of power that would reshape the world. At the stroke of noon on the 16th of November, 1532, in the Highland Plaza of Cajamarca, a Spanish friar approached the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, holding a cross and a breviary. The plaza was empty of Inca soldiers. The Spanish had hidden their cavalry and guns behind the surrounding buildings. Atahualpa had arrived with several thousand unarmed attendants, as was the custom for a peaceful meeting. The friar Vicente de Valverde spoke through a translator. He explained the Christian faith and demanded that the emperor submit to the Spanish crown and the Pope. Atahualpa looked at the book. He did not understand it as a holy text. He held it to his ear and listened. When it made no sound, he threw it to the ground. Valverde turned and shouted an order. From the building, Spanish soldiers emerged. Cannon fire ripped through the crowd. Horsemen charged into the unarmed Incas. Atahualpa was seized from his litter, which was carried by nobles. His attendants were cut down. Within minutes, thousands lay dead. Not a single Spanish soldier was killed that day. What happened? The Spanish had landed on the coast of present-day Peru in early 1532. Francisco Pizarro, a former pig farmer from Extremadura, had already attempted one expedition but failed. Now he returned with a smaller force, about 160 men, including his brothers and a handful of horses. They marched inland toward the Andes, following the Inca road system. Atahualpa was in the middle of a civil war with his half-brother Huascar over control of the empire. He had just won a decisive battle and was resting at the hot springs near Cajamarca. The Spanish arrived and sent an invitation to meet. Atahualpa agreed, perhaps out of curiosity or contempt. He did not view these bearded strangers as a serious threat. The size of his army, encamped in the hills around Cajamarca, numbered in the tens of thousands. But he came to the plaza unarmed, expecting to negotiate. The Spanish ambush succeeded because of surprise and the psychological shock of horses, guns, and steel. The Inca had never seen any of these. The central command was decapitated in a single afternoon. When investigators in later centuries pieced together the events from Spanish chronicles and indigenous testimonies, the sequence became clear. Atahualpa was held captive for months. He offered to fill a large room with gold and silver twice over to secure his release. The Spanish accepted. Over the next few months, the Incas stripped treasures from temples, palaces, and tombs. The room was filled with gold objects, sheets, figurines, and ornaments, an estimated 6 tons of gold and 12 tons of silver. Pizarro recorded the quantity meticulously, as the crown demanded a fifth of all treasure. The ransom was one of the greatest hoards in history, but the Spanish did not release Atahualpa. They feared that once free, he would raise an army. In July of 1533, after a mock trial, they executed him by strangulation. The room of gold was melted down into bars, shipped to Panama and then to Spain. The Inca Empire, already weakened by civil war and smallpox, collapsed into chaos. The Spanish marched on Cusco, the capital, and took it without a major battle. They installed puppet emperors and extracted tribute. How could this have happened? The Inca system of governance was highly centralized. The emperor was considered a god-king, a descendant of the sun. All authority flowed from him. When he was captured, the entire administrative apparatus seized up. The nobility, the quipu record keepers, the road runners, the army commanders all lost direction. The Spanish exploited this by using the captive emperor as a living instrument of command. Atahualpa himself ordered his generals not to attack the Spanish, believing that his release would be negotiated. When he was executed, the Inca resistance lacked unity. The Spanish allied with native groups that had been conquered by the Incas, including the Cañari and the Huanca, who saw an opportunity to break free. The Spanish also brought epidemic diseases that spread faster than their armies. Smallpox had already killed the previous emperor, Huayna Capac, and his designated heir, triggering the Civil War. Measles and typhus would follow. The population of the Andes declined by perhaps 90% over the next century. The systems that failed were many. The Inca road system, designed for rapid communication and troop movement, was turned against them by the Spanish, who used it to march from the coast to the highlands. The Inca system of storing food and supplies in government warehouses, meant to support the army and the people in times of scarcity, provided the Spanish with logistical support. The Inca system of mita, a rotational labor tax, was later co-opted by the Spanish to become a brutal forced labor system in the mines. The Incas had no writing system. They used quipus, knotted cords, for record keeping. The Spanish had written language, maps, and royal decrees that allowed them to administer their conquests from across the Atlantic. That asymmetry proved decisive. The conquest of the Inca Empire took about 40 years of sporadic warfare, but the core of the empire fell within 5 years of the capture of Atahualpa. The Spanish established the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1542, with its capital at Lima. From Lima, the crown controlled a territory that stretched from Panama to Chile. The administrative structure mirrored that of Mexico. There were audiencias, courts that served as both judicial and administrative bodies. There were corregidors, local officials who governed indigenous communities. And there was the church, which sent missionaries to convert the native population. The silver discovered at Potosi in present-day Bolivia in 1545 transformed the Spanish Empire from a network of plunder into a global economic machine. At 13,000 feet above sea level, the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, was a conical peak of silver ore so pure that it seemed to grow from the earth overnight. The Spanish imposed the mita system on the indigenous communities of the region, requiring each village to send a percentage of its adult male population to work in the mines. The work was brutal. Men descended into dark, narrow tunnels that were hot, choked with dust, and prone to collapse. They used hand tools to extract ore, which was then crushed, refined with mercury, and poured into bars. The mortality rate was high. Many miners died from accidents, silicosis, mercury poisoning, or simply from exhaustion. Others fled their communities to avoid the draft. The Spanish responded by expanding the mita and tightening control. At its peak in the late 16th century, Potosi produced more silver than any other mine in the world, about half of the global supply. The silver was transported by llama train to the coast, loaded onto ships at Arica or Callao, and sent north to Panama, where it crossed the isthmus on mules, then reloaded onto ships for the final voyage to Seville. The crown's share, the royal fifth, was collected at every stage and registered at the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade in Seville. This silver funded the Spanish army, the navy, the bureaucracy, and the wars of religion in Europe. It also paid for imports from across the world. Spain itself had little manufacturing. It bought goods from the Netherlands, Italy, and especially China, which traded silk, porcelain, and spices for silver. The Manila galleon, launched in 1565, connected the Philippines to Mexico. shipping Chinese goods across the Pacific to Acapulco, then overland to Veracruz, then across the Atlantic. The cycle of silver from Potosi to China and goods from China to Europe became the backbone of the first truly global economy. But the flood of silver had unforeseen consequences. In Spain, the sudden influx of precious metals caused inflation, the price revolution, that eroded the value of currency and hurt ordinary Spaniards. The crown borrowed heavily against future silver shipments, leading to repeated bankruptcies in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. The wealth that came from the Americas was not used to build sustainable industries at home. Instead, it financed military campaigns that drained the treasury. The Spanish economy became dependent on imported goods and foreign financiers. When silver production declined in the 17th century, the empire's financial foundation crumbled. The systems of extraction and control that the Spanish built in the Americas relied on the encomienda, which granted Spanish colonists the right to collect tribute and labor from designated groups of indigenous people in exchange for Christian instruction and protection. In practice, the encomienda was a system of forced labor, debt peonage, and abuse. The Crown, concerned about the loss of indigenous subjects and the reports of atrocities by missionaries like Bartolomé de las Casas, attempted to reform the system through the new laws of 1542. But the laws were resisted by colonists in Peru and Mexico, nearly triggering a rebellion in Peru. The Crown backed down. The encomienda was weakened but not abolished. It was replaced by the repartimiento, a system of rotational labor, which also devolved into exploitation. The indigenous population, already decimated by disease, could not sustain the labor demands. The Spanish shifted to African slavery, importing millions of enslaved people to work on plantations, in mines, and in households across the empire. The black population of Spanish America grew rapidly, especially in coastal regions. The role of the Catholic Church in the Spanish Empire was central. The Crown sponsored missions to convert the native population. Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and Jesuits built churches, monasteries, schools, and hospitals across the Americas. They learned indigenous languages, produced dictionaries and catechisms, and introduced European farming techniques, livestock, and crafts. But conversion was often coercive. The Spanish destroyed native temples, suppressed indigenous religions, and punished those who continued to practice them. The Inquisition was established in Lima and Mexico City to enforce orthodoxy. Indigenous people were technically outside the Inquisition's jurisdiction, but they were subject to religious courts run by bishops. The church also became a major landowner and a source of credit for the colonial economy. Why does this still matter? The Spanish Empire created the template for European colonialism. Its methods of conquest, exploitation, and cultural transformation were copied by the Portuguese, French, Dutch, and British. The extraction of precious metals from the Americas funded the rise of Europe and the integration of the global economy. The forced labor systems and the demographic collapse of indigenous populations set the stage for centuries of inequality, racial hierarchy, and conflict in Latin America. The legacies of the Spanish Empire are visible today in the languages, religions, and legal systems of an entire continent. And in the streets of Potosi, the Cerro Rico still stands, crumbling now, its top a massive open pit where the miners still work, often in conditions not much better than those of 400 years ago. The empire itself began to decline in the 17th century. The silver output of Potosi fell as the richest veins were exhausted and as mercury shortages and technical limitations affected production. The Crown faced increasing competition from England, France, and the Netherlands, whose pirates and privateers raided Spanish treasure fleets. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was a disaster that signaled the limits of Spanish naval power. War with the Netherlands drained resources. The 30 Years' War devastated Europe. The Portuguese, who had been under Spanish rule from 1580 to 1640, regained their independence in 1640. The empire held on, but it was increasingly on the defensive. In the 18th century, the Bourbon reforms attempted to modernize administration, increase revenue, and strengthen defenses. The crown tightened control over the colonies, expelled the Jesuits in 1767, and opened trade more broadly. But these reforms also stirred resentment among colonists, who saw their privileges curtailed and their taxes raised. The ideas of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution spread across the Atlantic. In the early 19th century, a series of rebellions led by figures like Simón Bolívar, José de San Martin, and Miguel Hidalgo tore apart the Spanish-American Empire. By 1825, only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines remained under Spanish rule. The empire that had dominated the world for 3 centuries was gone. What investigators of history have reconstructed is a story of almost unbelievable ambition, greed, violence, and endurance. The Spanish sailed across oceans they had never seen, into lands they had no maps of, and conquered empires that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1. They did it with a combination of steel, gunpowder, horses, disease, and a political system that allowed a few hundred men to leverage local resentments into massive alliances. They did it with a religious certainty that their cause was divine, and they did it for gold. But the gold they found was not only a reward, it was a curse. It destroyed the societies that had it and corrupted the ones that took it. The silver that flowed from Potosi and Zacatecas built palaces in Madrid and Seville, but it also built prisons and mines in the Americas. The God they carried was a God of salvation and a God of violence. The power they sought was absolute, but it proved fleeting. The Spanish Empire, for all its might, could not prevent its own collapse, and the lands it once ruled, from the Andes to the Philippines, still bear the scars of that encounter. At 2 in the morning on the 1st of August 1715, a fleet of 12 ships under the command of General Don Juan Esteban de Ubilla was making its way through the Florida Straits. They had left Havana 2 days earlier, bound for Cadiz. The cargo hold of each vessel was packed with silver coins, gold bars, and uncut emeralds from the mines of New Granada and Peru. Also on board were chests of Chinese porcelain and silk that had crossed the Pacific on the Manila galleon, unloaded at Acapulco, and carried overland to Veracruz. The total value of the fleet was estimated at 14 million pesos, a sum that could fund the Spanish crown for a year. But the weather was deteriorating. The barometer had been dropping all evening. The crew of the flagship, the Nuestra Señora de la Regla, noticed the increasing swell and the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Captain General Ubilla had received no warning from Havana. The Spanish had no organized meteorological service in the Caribbean. The fleet sailed on. By 3:30, the winds had reached hurricane force. The ships were scattered. The Nuestra Señora de la Regla lost its mainmast and began taking on water. At 4 in the morning, the flagship struck a reef near present-day Vero Beach. The hull split open. The sea poured in. Within minutes, the ship was gone, taking Ubilla and most of its crew down. Across the fleet, similar scenes unfolded. The Santa Rita, the San Miguel, the Nuestra Señora del Carmen, all were driven onto the shoals. Survivors clung to wreckage. When dawn broke, only one ship, the French-built frigate El Griffon, remained afloat. It had been separated from the fleet and managed to ride out the storm further south. The rest lay in pieces along 50 miles of coastline. More than 1,000 sailors, soldiers, and passengers died. The treasure was scattered across the ocean floor. What happened next was not a rescue. It was a salvage operation. The Spanish authorities in Havana learned of the disaster within days. A relief expedition was dispatched under Captain Francisco de la Rua, but the sea was rough, and the wreckage was spread across a dangerous coastline. Survivors who made it to shore were stranded without food or fresh water. Many died of thirst before help arrived. The Spanish quickly understood that the real problem was not the loss of life, but the loss of silver. The crown was already bankrupt. The War of the Spanish Succession had ended only 2 years earlier, leaving the treasury empty. The fleet's cargo was meant to pay off foreign debts and fund the next year's military campaigns. Without it, the empire was on the brink of collapse. Spanish salvagers began work within weeks. They built temporary camps on the beach and sent divers down to the wrecks. The divers were mostly indigenous and African slaves, chained to weighted ropes and lowered into the water. They could hold their breath for only a few minutes. They groped through the darkness, feeling for chests and bars. The first hauls recovered about 1/4 of the treasure, roughly 3.5 million pesos, but the rest remained buried under sand and coral. Spanish crown, desperate for funds, issued contracts to private salvagers. Over the next several decades, most of the silver was recovered, but a significant portion was never found. 11 ships, each carrying a fortune, had been wiped out by a single storm that nobody predicted. The disaster of 1715 was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern. The Spanish treasure fleet system, known as the Flota de Indias, had operated since the 1520s. 2 convoys left Spain each year, one for Veracruz and one for Portobelo or Cartagena, then rendezvoused in Havana before crossing the Atlantic together. The system was designed to protect against pirates and privateers, but it could not protect against the weather. Hurricanes in the Caribbean, hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, nor'easters off the coast of Florida. Records show that between 1500 and 1800, at least 70 treasure ships were lost to storms. The loss of the 1715 fleet was one of the worst, but not the worst. The 1622 fleet lost 8 ships, including the Atacha. The 1733 fleet lost 14 ships. The 1750 fleet lost 9. Each time, the crown borrowed against future silver to cover the loss. Each time, interest mounted. The empire was financing its wars on credit secured by metal that was already at the bottom of the ocean. But why did the Spanish continue to send cargoes across the hurricane zone year after year? Because there was no alternative. The silver had to move from the mines to the treasury, and the only practical route was by sea. The mule trains that carried silver from Potosi to the Pacific coast were slow and vulnerable. The overland route across Panama was a swampy nightmare. The only reliable way to move large quantities of bullion was in massive ships traveling together following the Gulf Stream. The Spanish knew the risks. They had lost ships for 2 centuries, but they had no other way to turn the wealth of the Americas into the power of Europe. The system failed not because the Spanish were careless, but because they were trapped. The mines kept producing, the crown kept needing, the fleets kept sailing, and the hurricanes kept coming. The 1715 disaster was a turning point. It forced the Spanish to reconsider their maritime strategy. They began to build faster, more maneuverable ships, and they started experimenting with early hurricane forecasting, relying on local knowledge of weather patterns passed down by indigenous pilots. But none of this prevented the next disaster. In 1733, another hurricane scattered the fleet off the Florida Keys. In 1750, another storm sank 9 ships near Cuba. The pattern continued until the end of the empire. The loss of the 1715 fleet also had a human dimension that is often overlooked. The survivors who made it ashore were not just sailors. They included women, children, and enslaved people traveling with the crews. Many of them were left on the coast without any shelter. The Spanish authorities did not prioritize their rescue. They prioritized the salvage. When the survivors were finally brought to Havana, they were destitute. The crown paid them a small compensation, but many families were ruined. The disaster destroyed entire communities in Seville and Cadiz, where the sailors and merchants had originated. The silver that never arrived meant that those who had invested in the fleet, the financiers, the suppliers, the merchants, lost everything. The Spanish economy was not just hurt by inflation and bankruptcy. It was hurt by the sudden, violent removal of liquid capital that had already been spent on promises, and the silver that was lost, that stayed on the seabed. It remained there for centuries. In the 1960s and 70s, treasure hunters began to find the wrecks. They recovered bars and coins worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The Spanish government claimed ownership, but the courts in the United States largely ruled in favor of the salvagers. The treasure of the 1715 fleet is now displayed in museums and sold at auctions. The coins, stamped with the crest of Philip V, still bear the marks of the sea. They are reminders of an empire that sent its wealth across an ocean and lost it to a storm that nobody saw coming. But the fleet disaster is only one thread in the larger story of the Spanish Empire's unraveling. To understand how the empire collapsed, we have to look not only at the silver that sank, but at the silver that did arrive and the people who mined it. And that brings us to a different kind of storm, a human storm that erupted in the Andes in the late 18th century. At 6 in the morning on the 4th of November 1780, in the small town of Tungasuka in the Peruvian highlands, a group of indigenous leaders arrested a Spanish colonial official named Antonio de Arriaga. Arriaga was the corregidor, the magistrate responsible for collecting taxes and enforcing labor drafts in the region. He was known for his cruelty, for forcing indigenous men to work in the mines for months without pay, for whipping those who resisted, for demanding tribute from families that could barely feed themselves. That morning, the leaders brought him before a crowd. The man who ordered the arrest was José Gabriel Condorcanqui, a wealthy indigenous merchant who claimed descent from the Inca emperors. He used the name Tupac Amaru II. He had spent years petitioning Spanish authorities for reforms, for justice, for an end to the abuses. He had been ignored. Now he was done petitioning. By noon, the news of Arriaga's arrest had spread to nearby towns. Tupac Amaru gathered an army, indigenous laborers, mining workers, peasants, and even some mestizos and criollos who resented Spanish rule. They came by the thousands. Arriaga was tried in a makeshift court. He was found guilty of corruption and murder. On the 10th of November, he was hanged in the main plaza of Tungasuka. The rebellion had begun. Tupac Amaru's forces marched toward Cusco, the ancient Inca capital. They grew to 60,000 men and women. They captured Spanish officials, seized weapons, and liberated prisoners. They declared an end to the mita, the forced labor system in the mines. They demanded the abolition of the repartimiento, the system of forced distribution of goods. They called for the independence of the indigenous peoples from Spanish rule. The Spanish authorities in Lima were caught off guard. They had no standing army in the region. They mobilized militias and sent for reinforcements from Buenos Aires. For 3 months, the rebellion spread across the Andes. Towns fell one after another. The Spanish retreated to their strongholds. Tupac Amaru tried to negotiate, but his demands were rejected. The rebellion turned violent. Indigenous forces attacked Spanish estates, killed colonists, and burned churches. The Spanish responded with a campaign of terror. They executed prisoners indiscriminately. They burned villages. They destroyed crops and livestock to starve the rebels into submission. In March 1781, Tupac Amaru was captured. The Spanish had offered amnesty to his followers and many had surrendered. He was betrayed by a former ally. He was brought to Cusco in chains. On the 18th of May, he was sentenced to death. The execution was designed to be a spectacle. He was forced to watch as his wife, his sons, and his closest associates were tortured and killed in front of him. Then he was taken to the main plaza. His tongue was cut out. His limbs were tied to 4 horses, but the horses could not pull him apart. The executioners then beheaded him and quartered his body. His remains were displayed in different towns as a warning. His home was razed. His name was banned. But the rebellion did not end. It continued under his half-brother, Diego Cristobal Tupac Amaru, and other leaders. It lasted until 1783. By the time it was over 100,000 people had died, mostly indigenous civilians killed by disease, starvation, or Spanish reprisals. The Spanish crown had spent enormous sums to suppress the uprising. The treasury was further drained. The rebellion exposed the fragility of colonial rule. The Spanish had won the war, but they had lost the moral authority to govern. How could this have happened? The Spanish had ruled the Andes for 250 years. They had built a system of control that relied on indigenous elites, local priests, and forced labor. But the system was built on exploitation. The mines of Potosi demanded constant replacements of workers because the death rate was so high. The Mita forced tens of thousands of indigenous men to leave their families and travel hundreds of miles to work in conditions that killed them within months. The tribute system extracted grain, cloth, and cash from communities that had little to give. The Spanish Church, despite its missions, did little to protect the indigenous population from the worst abuses. The reforms of the Bourbon monarchy in the 18th century, meant to centralize power and increase revenue, only made things worse. The crown raised taxes, tightened control over local administration, and reduced the power of the Creole elite. Indigenous communities lost their traditional rights to land and self-governance. Resentment built for decades. When Tupac Amaru raised his standard, he tapped into a reservoir of anger that had been filling since the days of Francisco Pizarro. The rebellion of Tupac Amaru II was not the first indigenous uprising, and it would not be the last, but it was the largest and most coordinated. It terrified the Spanish establishment. It demonstrated that the empire could not rely on the loyalty of its subjects. It also showed that the indigenous population, despite centuries of oppression, still possessed a collective identity and the capacity to organize. The rebellion accelerated the decline of Spanish power in the Andes. Within 40 years, the wars of independence would sweep through the continent, and the Spanish would be expelled for good. The events in Tungasuka, the execution in Cusco, the bodies quartered and displayed, they are not just historical curiosities. They are the human cost of an empire built on silver and faith. The gold that funded the cathedrals and palaces of Madrid was mined by hands that were forced, broken, and discarded. The God that the Spanish priests preached was a God of mercy, but the system they served was a system of violence. The power that the Spanish crown wielded was absolute in theory, but it was always fragile, always contested, always dependent on the cooperation of those it subjugated. And when that cooperation ended, as it did in 1780, the empire could not hold. The Spanish tried to crush the rebellion with force, and they succeeded in the short term. But they could not restore the illusion of invincibility. The message spread across the Americas, from the Andes to Mexico to the Rio de la Plata. The Spanish could be beaten. Now we turn to the question that hangs over the entire history of the Spanish Empire. How did a nation of fewer than 8 million people, on the edge of Europe, manage to conquer and control territories that span the globe for 3 centuries? The answer is found not only in the violence of conquest or the power of silver, but in a series of decisions made at the highest levels of the Spanish court, decisions that shaped the empire's structure and sealed its fate. One of those decisions was made on the 5th of October 1596 in the Royal Palace of Madrid. King Philip II was seated at his desk, surrounded by advisors. He was aging, burdened by gout, and exhausted by a lifetime of war. That morning, he received a report from his treasury. The numbers were clear. The crown was bankrupt. For the 3rd time in his reign, the state could not pay its debts. The bankers of Genoa and Augsburg, who had financed Spain's wars for decades, had refused to lend more money. The soldiers in the Spanish army, the finest in Europe, had not been paid in months. They were mutinying in Flanders, looting the towns they were supposed to protect. The silver fleets from the Americas, which had arrived in Seville that summer, had already been spent on debts from previous wars. There was nothing left. Philip II was the most powerful monarch in the world. His empire stretched from Milan to Manila, from Naples to the Andes, and yet he could not pay his bills. How could that be? The answer lies in the nature of Spanish imperialism. The empire was not a centralized state that taxed its citizens efficiently. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, councils, and privileges, each with its own laws and exemptions. The nobility paid no taxes. The clergy paid no taxes. The towns had their own charters and resisted new levies. The only real source of revenue was the silver and gold from the Americas, and that was never enough. The crown spent the silver as soon as it arrived, often before it arrived, borrowing against future shipments. The wars in Europe, the defense of the Mediterranean, the suppression of revolts in the Netherlands, the expedition of the Armada against England, all of them cost more than the mines could produce. Philip II had inherited a debt from his father, Charles V. He increased it. In 1557, Spain defaulted for the first time. Then in 1560, 1575, and now 1576. Each default gave the crown temporary relief, but it also drove up the cost of future borrowing. The bankers knew the crown was unreliable. They charged higher interest rates. The debt spiraled. The military, which was the backbone of Spanish power, began to disintegrate. Soldiers deserted. Fortresses fell into disrepair. The navy was reduced to skeleton crews. By the time Philip II died in 1598, the empire was a shell, magnificent on the outside, hollow within. What investigators of history have found is that the Spanish Empire suffered from a fundamental contradiction. It was an empire of extraction, but it was run by a bureaucracy that could not manage the resources it extracted. It was a military superpower, but its wars were financed by foreign loans that could be called in at any moment. It was a Catholic monarchy that claimed divine authority, but its subjects, from the indigenous laborers in Potosi to the peasants of Castile, were increasingly unwilling to sacrifice for a cause that did not benefit them. The empire did not fall all at once. It decayed slowly. The 17th century was a long decline, broken only by brief moments of recovery. The silver output fell. The population of Spain declined due to war, disease, and emigration. The textile industry of Castile, once the pride of Europe, collapsed under the weight of competition from cheaper goods imported from Flanders and Asia. The trade routes shifted. The Dutch and English began to dominate the Atlantic. The Portuguese controlled the Indian Ocean. The Spanish were left with a shrinking network of colonies that required constant military protection. By the time the Bourbons took the throne in the 18th century, the empire was a shadow of what it had been. The reforms of the Bourbons, the expulsion of the Jesuits, the opening of trade, the increase in administrative efficiency, all of these measures slowed the decline but could not reverse it. The empire was too vast, too stratified, too dependent on force to adapt to the changing world. The final blow came not from Europe but from the colonies themselves. The Creole elites, the descendants of Spanish settlers born in America, had grown tired of being ruled by officials from Madrid. They wanted control over their own economies, their own governments, their own destinies. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, triggering a crisis of legitimacy in the Spanish crown, the Creoles seized the opportunity. They formed juntas, declared independence, and fought wars that lasted until 1815. One by one, the colonies fell. Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, all of them broke away. The Spanish Empire, which had once controlled half the world, was reduced to Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a handful of islands in the Pacific. The empire that had brought the Americas into a single global system had created the conditions for its own destruction. What remains? The language, the religion, the legal codes, the architecture, the art, the food, the horses, the cattle, the wheat, the grapes, the olives, the diseases, the racial hierarchies, the inequality. The Spanish Empire reshaped the world in ways that are still visible. The silver from Potosi funded the rise of global trade. The forced migration of millions of Africans and the destruction of indigenous societies created the demographic foundations of Latin America. The Catholic Church built institutions that still dominate education and politics in much of the region. The legal system, based on Roman law and the Code of the Indies, still governs property rights and land ownership. But the empire also left a legacy of violence and extraction that has never been fully addressed. The Cerro Rico in Potosi still stands, a monument to centuries of death. The descendants of the miners still work there, breathing the dust, dying young. The indigenous communities of the Andes still struggle for land and recognition. The Afro-descendant populations of the Caribbean and Brazil still face discrimination. The gap between the rich and the poor in Latin America is among the highest in the world, a direct inheritance of the colonial system. The story of the Spanish Empire is not a story of glory, though it contains moments of extraordinary achievement. It is not a story of villainy, though it contains acts of unimaginable cruelty. It is a story of systems, of how a small group of people, driven by a mix of ambition, greed, and faith, managed to create a global empire that lasted for 300 years, and how that empire crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The gold that was mined is now scattered in museums, hoards, and bank vaults. The God that was preached has been adapted, syncretized, and transformed into vibrant local traditions. The global power that Spain once commanded has long since passed to other nations. But the questions that the empire raised, about the relationship between power and wealth, about the cost of progress, about the moral obligations of the powerful, these questions remain as relevant today as they were when the first ships left the coast of Spain in 1490. And so the history of the Spanish Empire is not a comfortable bedtime story. It is a reminder that the pursuit of gold, the imposition of God, and the quest for global power come with consequences that last for centuries. The world we live in today, with its globalized economy, its inequalities, its religious tensions, its militarized borders, was shaped in large part by the decisions made in Seville, in Cusco, in Potosi, and in Manila, decisions that were often made in a hurry, with incomplete information, and with a confidence that turned out to be misplaced. The Spanish Empire ended long ago, but its shadow still falls across the land. At 2 p.m. on the 20th of July 1588, the Spanish Armada was first sighted off the coast of Cornwall. The fleet had left Lisbon on the 28th of May, but storms had scattered the ships. Now they were reassembling, moving slowly up the English Channel in a crescent formation. The English Navy, under Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake, had been watching from Plymouth. Beacon fires had been lit along the coast. The alarm spread through the county. The Armada was 130 ships strong. It carried 30,000 men, 2,000 pieces of artillery, and enough supplies to last several months. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in European waters. At 8 p.m. that evening, the Spanish anchored near Plymouth. Medina Sidonia, the Spanish commander, had strict orders from King Philip II. He was not to engage the English fleet unless necessary. His primary mission was to sail to the coast of Flanders, pick up the army of the Duke of Parma, and escort it across the Channel to invade England. The English had other plans. They launched fireships at midnight on the 29th of July. The Spanish cut their anchor cables and scattered. At 4 a.m. on the 30th of July, the two fleets clashed off gravelines. The English ships were faster and had longer-range cannon. The Spanish ships, designed for boarding, could not get close enough to use their own guns effectively. The battle lasted until late afternoon. By then, the Armada had lost 5 ships and was running low on ammunition. At 10 a.m. on the 31st of July, Medina Sidonia gave the order to retreat. The Armada sailed north around Scotland and then south along the west coast of Ireland. The weather had shifted. Storms drove the ships onto rocky shores. Many wrecked, hundreds drowned. Of the 130 ships that had left Lisbon, only 67 returned to Spain. The rest were lost to battle, weather, and starvation. What happened? The failure of the Armada was not a single mistake. It was a cascade of miscalculations that began years earlier. Philip II had believed that the English would not expect an invasion. He had also assumed that the Dutch rebels would be neutralized by a quick victory. Neither was true. The English had known about the Armada for months. Their spies in Lisbon and Madrid had sent detailed reports. They knew the number of ships, the troop strength, the intended landing site. They had time to prepare. The Spanish command structure was also flawed. Medina Sidonia was a capable administrator but had no experience in naval warfare. He had been appointed because of his noble status and loyalty, not his skill. He had tried to refuse the command, but Philip II insisted. The fleet itself was a mix of warships, merchant vessels, and armed transports. The warships were fitted with heavy guns that were slow to reload and could not be aimed effectively. The English, by contrast, had developed a tactic of rapid broadside fire that could cripple an enemy ship without boarding. The coordination with Parma was impossible. The Armada needed to anchor off Dunkirk to load the army, but the harbor was shallow. The ships could not get close to the shore. The Dutch had blockaded the coast with their own fleet. Parma had no way to reach the Armada. The plan had been built on an assumption that the channel would be clear, but it was not. The aftermath was devastating for Spain. The loss of men, ships, and supplies was huge, but the psychological impact was greater. The Armada had been presented as a crusade, a holy mission to restore Catholicism to England. Its failure was seen as a sign that God had abandoned the Spanish cause. The Pope had blessed the fleet. The prayers had been said. The ships had sailed with the image of the Virgin Mary on their flags, and yet they had been defeated by a smaller, faster navy and by the weather. The Crown had borrowed heavily to finance the Armada. The loans came from German and Italian bankers who demanded interest rates of 10% or more. The silver from the Americas had been pledged as collateral. When the Armada failed, the silver was not enough to cover the debts. Spain defaulted again in 1596, the fourth default in 40 years. The bankers stopped lending. The army went unpaid. The forts in the Netherlands fell into disrepair. One of the unanswered questions in this story is why Philip II continued to pursue such an expensive war when his empire was already in financial ruin. The answer lies in the nature of his beliefs. Philip II saw himself as the defender of the true faith. He believed that God would provide for his empire if he remained faithful. He did not see the contradiction between his religious duty and his economic reality. He spent money he did not have on wars he could not win, all in the name of God. But the Armada was only one part of a larger pattern. The empire had been built on extraction, not production. The silver came from Potosi, but the refineries were in Spain, and the trade was controlled by foreign merchants. The goods that were exported to the colonies were made in Flanders, Italy, or England. The Spanish middle class, the farmers and artisans who could have built a domestic economy, were taxed into poverty or driven out by inflation. The gold that arrived from the Americas was used to buy Chinese silks and spices in Manila, which were then sold in Mexico. The profit went to the Asian merchants, not to Spain. By the time Philip II died in 1598, the empire was already in decline. His successor, Philip III, inherited a kingdom that was bankrupt, a military that was demoralized, and a population that was exhausted. The 17th century became a long period of stagnation. The population of Spain fell from 9 million to 7 million. The cities shrank. The roads fell into disrepair. The universities closed. The only institutions that grew were the Inquisition and the Church. The empire survived because the colonies were still producing silver. But even that was unsustainable. The mines at Potosi were reaching deeper into the earth. The quality of the ore was declining. The cost of extraction was rising. The indigenous laborers who were forced to work in the mines under the Mita system were dying at high rates. The population of the Andes had fallen by 80% since the conquest. The Spanish could not find enough workers to keep the mines running. At 11 a.m. on the 8th of September 1628, a Dutch squadron under Piet Hein intercepted the Spanish treasure fleet in the Bay of Matanzas, Cuba. The fleet was carrying more than 5,000 kilograms of silver and 1,000 kilograms of gold. The Spanish captain, unable to escape, surrendered without firing a shot. Hein took the entire fleet. The loss was equivalent to a full year of imperial revenue. The Dutch used the silver to finance their war against Spain. The Spanish crown had spent the money before it arrived. The ninth default followed in 1620. How could this have happened? The Spanish had established a convoy system to protect the treasure ships. 2 fleets sailed each year, one to Mexico and one to South America. They were supposed to be escorted by warships, but the warships were often old and poorly crewed. The captains were chosen for their political connections, not their skill. The schedules were widely known. The Dutch had agents in Seville and Cadiz who reported the sailing dates. The element of surprise was lost. The capture of the fleet was a disaster, but it was not the end. The empire still controlled a vast territory, but the cracks were widening. In 1640, Portugal revolted and regained its independence. The Spanish army was too weak to stop it. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. Spain had lost its richest province. The wars in Europe continued, but Spain could no longer afford them. The 18th century brought a brief revival under the Bourbon kings. They introduced administrative reforms, opened trade to more ports, and increased tax collection. But the structure of the empire did not change. The colonies were still ruled by officials from Spain. The Creole elites were still excluded from power. The indigenous and African populations were still exploited. The reforms came too late. At dawn on the 16th of September 1810, the priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the bell of the church in Dolores, Mexico. He asked the crowd to join him in a rebellion against the Spanish government. The cry was spontaneous. The movement grew rapidly. Within weeks, Hidalgo had an army of 80,000 men. They marched toward Mexico City. The Spanish authorities were caught by surprise. They had been focused on the war in Europe. They had not expected an uprising from the countryside. But Hidalgo was not prepared for power. He hesitated outside Mexico City. The Spanish regrouped. The rebellion was crushed. Hidalgo was captured and executed. Yet the idea of independence did not die. Other leaders took up the cause. By 1821, Mexico was independent. By 1825, the entire mainland of Spanish America was free. The Spanish Empire, which had once stretched from California to Patagonia, was reduced to a few islands. The global power that Spain had wielded for 3 centuries was gone. The gold was gone. The ships were gone. The soldiers were dead. What remained was the shadow. That shadow is still visible in the architecture of colonial cities, in the language spoken by 500 million people, in the faith of the Catholic Church, and in the inequality that defines much of Latin America. The Spanish Empire was one of the most powerful forces in human history. Its rise was driven by gold, God, and global ambition. Its fall was driven by debt, overreach, and the weight of its own contradictions. The lessons of that fall are not abstract. They are written in the geography of the Andes, in the streets of Mexico City, in the fields of the Philippines. The empire answered the question of what happens when power is concentrated in a single crown, when resources are extracted without investment, and when the cost of ambition is deferred to future generations. The answer is collapse, but the collapse does not erase the impact. The Spanish Empire changed the world, and the world has not stopped changing in response. At 7 a.m. on the 3rd of July 1898, the Spanish fleet under Admiral Pascual Cervera attempted to break out of Santiago de Cuba. The American Navy had blockaded the harbor for weeks. Cervera knew his ships were outdated. The Spanish cruisers were wooden-hulled, slow, and armed with guns that could not reach the American battleships. The American ships were steel, faster, and better trained. Cervera had argued against sailing from Spain. He knew the mission was hopeless, but the Spanish government ordered him to proceed. The political pressure was too great. The empire could not afford another loss of prestige. Cervera's squadron emerged from the harbor in single file. The American fleet opened fire almost immediately. Within 4 hours, every Spanish ship was sunk or beached. 350 Spanish sailors were dead. Another 1,500 were captured. The American losses were 1 killed. The battle was over before the American public could fully understand what had happened. The Spanish-American War lasted only 10 weeks. By the end of it, Spain had lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The empire that had once controlled half the world was reduced to a few scattered possessions in Africa. What happened in the years between the loss of the mainland colonies and the disaster of 1898? The empire had tried to reform. The Bourbon kings had introduced free trade, opened ports, and encouraged immigration. But the structural problems remained. Spain had never industrialized. Its economy was still based on agriculture and mining. The colonies that remained, Cuba and the Philippines, were profitable, but they were also restless. Cuban planters wanted more autonomy. Philippine nationalists wanted independence. The Spanish government responded with repression and broken promises. In Cuba, the 10 years, war from 1868 to 1878 had already drained the treasury. Spain poured troops and money into the island, but it could not pacify the rebels. The war ended with a treaty that promised reforms, but the reforms were never fully implemented. The American press began to report on Spanish atrocities in Cuba. Public opinion in the United States turned sharply against Spain. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on the 15th of February 1898, the war became inevitable. The cause of the explosion remains unclear: a coal fire, a mine, or an accident, but the American public had already made up its mind. The aftermath of 1898 was devastating for Spain. The loss of Cuba ended the last major source of colonial revenue. The Spanish economy contracted. The country entered a period of soul-searching that lasted for decades. The generation of 1898, a group of writers and intellectuals, asked what had gone wrong. They blamed the empire itself, the obsession with glory, the reliance on extraction, the failure to build a modern society. But the answers came too late to change the course of history. How could an empire that had once commanded the largest fleet in the world end up with wooden ships against steel battleships? The answer lies in the long decline. After the Armada, Spain never rebuilt its navy to the same standard. The silver that could have funded modernization was wasted on European wars. By the late 19th century, Spain had fallen behind not only Britain and France, but also the United States and Germany. The empire had become a relic of an earlier age, clinging to colonies it could no longer defend. The Spanish Empire did not end with a single battle. It ended with a series of quiet surrenders, legal treaties, and reluctant withdrawals. The last Spanish troops left Cuba in December 1898. The Philippine Republic was declared in June 1898, but it was soon crushed by the United States. Puerto Rico became an American territory. Spain sold the Caroline Islands and Palau to Germany in 1899. By 1900, the empire that had once stretched around the world was reduced to a few small territories in Africa: the Spanish Sahara, Equatorial Guinea, and the enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. These territories remained under Spanish control until the 20th century. Spanish Sahara was withdrawn in 1975. Equatorial Guinea gained independence in 1968. The empire was finally gone. But the legacy of gold, God, and global power did not vanish. It survived in the language, in the cathedral squares of 100 cities, in the bloodlines of millions of people, and in the deep inequality that the empire had carved into the land. The Spanish Empire had built a world order on the premise that extraction was sustainable. History proved otherwise. The gold ran out. The power faded. The God who had been invoked to bless the conquest was silent, and the empire, for all its ambition, became a memory,